Well, let's get started if we could. My name is Richard Broadhead. I'm the president of Duke, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We know that when humans are gathered in any significant concentration, there is the capacity for them to divide up, for tensions to form between these groups, for those tensions to precipitate acts of great harm and hatred against one another. And what do people feel after that? Bitterness, hatred, loss, and in the wake of those emotions, we get this kind of situation well known to us all, in which groups of people begin to revisit that injury on one another, and back on one another, and back on one another, in a cycle of recrimination in which each side feels deeply justified, and in which everyone loses. Human life as we know it would be worse than it is, human as that is, if it were not also true that humans have the capacity to do other things, namely, at the very same juncture, to take a step back, to try to talk across those lines of division, to tell one another what they think, to listen to what the other side thinks, and to try to achieve the possibility of mutual understanding, and possibly even, dare one hope, reconciliation, and possibly even make both sides of an apparently immitigable division partners in the building of a better human world. We have people on the stage tonight who have come here in the cause of the latter rather than the former cause, but the former is what provokes it. We have on stage, and I say it with great sorrow, a father who has incurred the deepest of loss, a father who has lost a son in the religious war of our times, the son being Daniel Pearl, the correspondent, a non-combatant who was in Pakistan when he was kidnapped and murdered in February of the year 2000. And in the wake of this, with all the provocation to recrimination and retaliation that would have been in place there, this person has instead become a party to a dialogue with another person who has stepped forward. The father is Judea Pearl. The other person is Akbar Ahmed, a principal figure from Pakistan in this country and a principal scholar of Islam in the West. And the two of these people, over against the conflicts of our time, have decided to write a different history, a history of dialogue, a history of the attempt to witness and make manifest the possibility of a different kind of interaction in which it would be possible to achieve the kind of understanding and thereby the road to the productive alternative that I have mentioned. Duke is very honored for the two of you to come here this evening. It will be very instructive for us to hear you, and it is very moving for us to have you here. I just want to, guess what? I'm not doing the introductions. I'm introducing the introducer, but along my way to do so, I would like to thank the planning committee that made this event possible. This has been the result of an interfaith effort, and I would thank its head, Chaplain Rutledge, the Assistant Dean of Duke Chapel, Craig Coker, Imam Abdul Hafiz Wahid of the Al-Rakaz Islamic Center, Ari Dubin of the Freeman Center of Jewish Life, Susan Kaufman of Public Affairs, and Program Manager Susan Brooks and Staff Assistant Doris Jordan of the Kenan Institute of Ethics. All these people have helped make this possible, but we have a richer background than their help to cause this event to come to Duke. This was the scene this fall of a conference involving the Palestinian Solidarity Movement that helped to revive the animosities between Judaism and Islam, and therefore helped to revive a sense of the importance of finding a constructive rather than a destructive relation among these. I'm very grateful for our two visitors that this is the last and not the first of their events at this place. They've spent the day visiting with local religious leaders, our religious life staff, the media, and many Duke undergraduates, including the ones they had dinner with, a group calling itself Arab and Jewish Students for Dialogue. If you came to us merely as outside visitors, bearing no relation to anything that took place inside this community, it would be a source of loss and regret, I think. And so I'm grateful for all of you who come here, having done your own part to build the dialogue among parties to possible conflict that will be furthered by our speaker. I'd now like to ask Elizabeth Quiche, the head of the Kenan Institute for Ethics, to come and do the proper introductions, and I thank our guests so much for being here.
Thank you so much, President Broadhead, and welcome all of you to the Daniel Pearl Dialogue for Muslim-Jewish Understanding. My name is Elizabeth Quiche. I direct Duke's Kenan Institute for Ethics, and I have the very great honor of being this evening's moderator. President Broadhead has already thanked the organizing committee, whose members have done a splendid job of pulling this event together. I would like to reciprocate by thanking our president, who has not only made this evening's dialogue possible through his financial sponsorship, but has also, on occasions too numerous to mention since he came to Duke last July, spoken up for, and in the spirit of, dialogue and open inquiry as core values of liberal education and of the modern university. As he put it in his convocation address to freshmen last fall, American universities have taken far more trouble to host athletic contests than most sorts of intellectual contention. But since powerful differences shape the force field of our lives, the sides had better learn something about each other and, dare one hope it, learn something from each other. Learning about each other and from each other in a spirit of critical honesty and deep humanity. This is perhaps the most important kind of ethical conversation we can have in a world which is so often divided by fear, hatred, ignorance, and negative stereotypes. This evening, we're privileged to be in the presence of two men who have committed themselves to this process of shared inquiry and who have invited us along to join them on their journey. The Daniel Pearl Dialogue for Muslim-Jewish Understanding came out of a remarkable meeting of mind and heart between Dr. Judea Pearl and Dr. Akbar Ahmed. The dialogue, like so much that is true and beautiful in our world, is grounded in tragedy and grief. As Dr. Broadhead has said, 3 years ago, Dr. Pearl's son Daniel, a Wall Street Journal reporter with a strong commitment to interfaith and intercultural understanding, was murdered by Islamic extremists in Pakistan. That shattering event led Dr. Pearl and his family to react in an extraordinary way, as he put it, to seek revenge, not against the man who'd murdered Daniel, but against the hatred that led to his murder. The Pearl family committed themselves to advancing Danny Pearl's agenda of interfaith and intercultural understanding and friendship through journalism, through music, and through innovative communications. In exploring the work the foundation could do, Dr. Judea Pearl had the good fortune to be introduced, and in fact the man who introduced them is also here with us this evening, Louis Jaffe, but to be introduced to Dr. Akbar Ahmed, one of the world's leading authorities on Islam today. The two men, both scholars, both grandfathers, created this dialogue out of their shared conviction that there was an urgent need for understanding and reconciliation between Muslims and Jews, one that they hoped their personal yet public dialogue could help foster and foment. Daniel Pearl dialogues have been held in 5 locations so far: Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Williamsburg, Virginia, London, and Chicago. The Duke dialogue is the 6th, and we hope there will be many more, including someday in Pakistan, in Israel, and in Palestine. Let me now introduce Dr. Pearl and Dr. Ahmed and explain the format of this evening's dialogue. Judea Pearl is president of the Daniel Pearl Foundation and a distinguished professor of computer science and statistics at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's been a pioneer in the field of artificial intelligence and philosophy of science and is the director of UCLA's Cognitive Systems Laboratory. A member of the National Academy of Engineering, Dr. Pearl is also a foundation fellow of the American Association for Artificial Intelligence and a recipient of several prestigious scientific awards. Dr. Pearl and his wife Ruth are co-editors of the book I Am Jewish, Personal Reflections Inspired by the Last Words of Daniel Pearl, which will be available for sale and for signing after the dialogue. Akbar Ahmed is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies and Professor of International Relations at American University in Washington, D.C., and has been described by the BBC as probably the world's best-known scholar on contemporary Islam. He is the author of many books, including Discovering Islam, Making Sense of Muslim History and Society, Postmodernism in Islam, Predicament and Promise, and most recently, Islam Under Siege, Living Dangerously in a Post-Honor World, which will also be available following this evening's program. In addition to his scholarly work, Dr. Ahmed has served as the former High Commissioner of Pakistan to Great Britain and has advised world leaders on Islam and appeared widely in the national media. Now here's the format that we'll follow for this evening's dialogue. It will be divided into 4 segments. First, we'll have an opening statement, each from Dr. Pearl and Dr. Ahmed. Next, each of them will share with us a brief reflection on something that they've read or experienced or written since their last dialogue, which happened in October of 2004. These are not staged pieces, which are the same dialogue over and over again. These evolve. It's an evolving conversation. And then finally, they will each offer some thoughts about current events, about Jewish-Muslim relations today, with particular emphasis on common ground, on fears, on Israel-Palestine, on Iraq, on all that has happened, many things that have happened since October 2004. Fourth, then, we will turn to audience Q&A, and we'll have microphones up here at the front. We'll ask people to come to those microphones, and I'll be asking audience members to speak for no more than 2 minutes in posing a question to make sure that we give as many people an opportunity to join the conversation as possible. At the end, I'll ask Professors Pearl and Ahmed to offer us some brief closing reflections. So I'd like now to welcome Professor Pearl and Professor Ahmed and ask Professor Pearl to begin with his opening statement.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Three years and 10 days ago, in a desolate dungeon in Karachi, Pakistan, a young man was looking straight in the eyes of evil and proclaimed his identity. I am Jewish American journalist, he said. My father is Jewish, my mother is Jewish, and I am Jewish. He was then silenced forever. That young man was my son, Danny, a walking sunshine of truth, humor, and humanity, an emissary of friendship and goodwill, a bridge builder who gave voice to millions of voiceless Muslims in the Middle East, a journalist who unveiled to readers in the West the human face of the people behind the news. His murderers schemed to sow fear and division among us, but strangely, with all their technical sophistication, they made a miscalculation and the outcome turned against them. How? The respect that Daniel earned on both sides of the East-West divide, the goodness of his smile, the principles by which he lived, and the sound of his last words became iconic reminders to millions of people around the world that the current wave of terror and hatred is not an expression of an ordinary conflict, but threatens to erode the very fabric of civilized society. And Danny's last words, I'm Jewish, have thus assumed a universal dimension and came to symbolize the freedom of every individual to assert his faith, heritage, and identity, and the wonderful capacity of the human spirit to embed the dignity of being different within the oneness of mankind. Consequently, what emerged from Danny's tragedy and vividly displayed on the screens of world consciousness was an urgent call for people of all faiths to recognize the dangers threatening civilized society and to lift our common humanity above the differences that set us apart. It was this urgent call that compelled my family and I to establish a Daniel Pearl Foundation and to take upon ourselves the task of channeling all the energy and goodwill that the tragedy had evoked into one and only one aim, This is fighting the hatred that took Danny's life. Of course, we do not have resources to move armies or conquer territories, but we have the goodwill and energy of millions of principled people around the world, Christians, Jews and Muslims, Pakistanis, Israelis and Palestinians, journalists and musicians who are determined to take a stand for tolerance and humanity. In the Daniel Pearl Dialogue program that we have the privilege to bring today to Duke University was initiated by Professor Ahmed and myself out of concern for the deteriorating relationship between the two communities and out of an unshaken belief that these relationships could be improved by engaging in a frank and rational dialogue based on our common Abrahamic traditions. We see our mission in this dialogue as that of carving a path of legitimacy for ongoing community conversation in the which will achieve, in the best case, understanding and cooperation, and at the very least, acknowledgement of and familiarity with each other narrative. We thank President Broadhead, the Kenan Institute, our sponsors, and especially you, the audience, for hosting this program in your esteemed university. And we hope for your continuous support in seeing it spread in many communities hereforth. I would like to end this introductory remarks by pointing out that my friend Professor Ahmed has received last month the Professor of the Year award in Washington, D.C. And last week, a special three-faith service was dedicated in his honor in the National Cathedral, led by Bishop John Chain, and with the participation of Rabbi Lustig, head of the Washington Hebrew congregation. Please join me in congratulating Professor Ahmed for this unique honor and a well-deserved one. Thank you.
Thank you, Judea. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, President Broadhead. You yourself are a great symbol of dialogue, and we are grateful that you've invited us to this beautiful university and this beautiful campus. I've been a Princeton man, and I see the architecture and I'm inspired and nostalgic. I want to also very briefly acknowledge some people in the audience. I have a wonderful class. I teach at American University, and I've got two wonderful students, Jesse and Megan. Their parents are here, so I'm delighted they're here with us this evening. They've driven long distances. The great scholars of Islam on campus, Professor Bruce Lawrence, Miriam Cook, Ibrahim Musa, and of course Imam Wahid, and our friend Louis Jaffe, who's come all the way from Pittsburgh for this evening. And of course, finally, my dear friend Judea Pearl, who I have now come to respect and know as a friend. I had begun this journey with a stranger. We have now become great friends. I have learned so much from him, not only about Judaism and Israel, but about life, about sorrow, about how to face life with grace, with dignity, and with vision. And I've come to know through him this remarkable young man, Danny Pearl, who I never met, but I have come to feel that I know him. And he is now a kind of symbol and a bridge that we are creating and building in the hope that it will lessen the hatred that took his life so tragically. Danny Pearl is, of course, one landmark event in the Muslim world. If you saw the news this evening, you would have seen that 125 people were killed in Iraq. There's a sense of anarchy throughout the Muslim world. It isn't only Iraq, it is Afghanistan, it is Kashmir. We were talking about Chechnya earlier in the evening, the Palestinians. This sense of anarchy feeds into the sense of anger, and anger easily converts into violence. So the basic basic tenets of Islam, the basic features of Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, which rest in the notion of balance, and there's a word for it in Islam, in the notion of justice, in the notion of friendship and hospitality, those notions are all affected. And these are the core features that we are seeing now under pressure, under this almost tidal wave of anger that is sweeping the Muslim world. At its core, Islam remains one of the most remarkably stable religious systems. Its definition of God derives from the 99 names of God, and two of the most repeated names, the attributes of God, Rahman and Rahim, these are repeated throughout the day by Muslims, mean compassion and mercy. The greatest title of the Prophet of Islam is a mercy unto mankind. The favorite figure, the person who inspires the Prophet the most, is none other than Jesus. There's an entire chapter in the Quran called Mary. I'm pointing this all out because in this dialogue it's important to point out how much there is in common, how much in fact it is important to point out that Islam itself is part of the Abrahamic tradition. Notions of the divine, of prophethood, of the afterlife, of a holy book, of the 10 Commandments, these are all common in Islam and common certainly with the Judeo-Christian tradition. In fact, President Bush, and I don't want to go into Democrat-Republican politics here, but President Bush was the first president who actually mentioned the Quran at his inaugural address, if you recall, last month. So in a sense, Islam has arrived in the United States of America. The question is, why should we be looking at this new phenomena that suddenly burst upon the scene, and not always in a very positive light, as we are seeing in the discussion around Danny Pearl? It is important because Islam is a civilization of 1.3 billion people. Because Islam has 57 states, one nuclear for the time being, maybe more soon. Islam has 7 million adherents here in the United States of America. They are a very distinguished and an indigenous Muslim population. We often forget that the African Americans were Muslims long before the Arabs and the Pakistanis and the Bangladeshis came here. That some of the greatest heroes of America are actually Muslim. Muhammad Ali the boxer, he's a Muslim, he's a great American hero. In the Muslim world, he's also a great Muslim hero. So America has these reasons to understand Islam. And then finally, the war on terror. Just look at the world map, look at the map of the Middle East and Central Asia. And if you make a list of the most wanted figures in that part of the world, there will be Muslim names. If you make a list of the 10 most wanted, it will be Osama bin Laden, Mullah Omar, and so on. But if you make a list of the 10 closest allies without whom the United States could not continue this war on terror for 24 hours, they would also be all Muslim. President Musharraf, Karzai, the people now running Iraq, these are all Muslim figures. So we need to constantly remember that while Islam comes as a monolith to a lot of Americans assume here as a monolith, in fact it is a vast civilization of different cultures, different peoples, different thoughts, and at the core there is a religion, there is a religious set of beliefs that is Islam. And it is in our interest to very quickly understand that, engage with it, like Judea is doing, and why I admire Judea so much is that this is exactly what he's doing. He wants to understand what is Islam. And he's frank enough, he's big enough to say, I may make mistakes, help me understand. And that is the process. If anything, you take away this evening from this session, is the fact that we need to be reaching out and building bridges of understanding. If you can go away with that idea, you would have certainly accepted my message and the message of Danny Pearl. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to ask each of you to share with us a bit of your your own recent journey. You had your most recent dialogue in October, so just a few short months ago. But a lot has happened since then. Could you say a bit about something that you've perhaps read or experienced or written in those few months since that has shaped your thinking? And Akbar, why don't you start?
Well, I came across something very interesting recently. And in fact, I discussed it in class, so Megan and Jesse would know about this. In fact, let me ask their parents, who do you think is the most popular poet in the United States of America? Anyone? Rumi. So here we are, President Broadhead, a very literate campus you have, very, very good A marks for that. Rumi is the #1 poet of America. Now what does this tell us? The choices we would assume would be Poe or Frost or Whitman, and yet Rumi, a man who was born in Balkh. Balkh is in Afghanistan. Born in the 13th century, is the most popular poet based on the book sold, and this will be confirmed by any bookshop you visit, because it tells us about Rumi, and Rumi comes with all the regular fan club without which you cannot be #1 in the United States, which means Madonna, which means Goldie Hawn, all these people, they're all great fans of Rumi. But it also tells us so much about the United States, about Americans today. Americans are looking for answers beyond the everyday. They are looking for answers beyond the materialism, beyond the consumerism that seem to dominate our lives. And Rumi provides one answer. He is the eternal mystic. He talks of love. He talks of universal love. He talks of visiting the synagogue, the church, the mosque. And remember, he's writing in the 13th century. This is incredible. A man who's writing long before America is discovered. And he says, I go to the synagogue, to the church and the mosque, and what do I see? I see the same spirit and I see the same altar. For me, these are really different paths to the same divine being who I love, and I reflect that love in this divine being. And this is the love that I see in my human fellow citizens and fellow strangers and fellow friends and fellow people around me. And I believe that this is what gives me a lot of hope, that in spite of the clash of civilizations, in spite of all the crises taking place in our lives, we do have figures like the fact that Rumi is the most popular poet in America, coming up in terms of heart statistics. It gives me a lot of hope for America and for the world. And these are I believe, the signs that are very positive in society.
Thank you. Judea?
I was moved by a piece of news that I read in the Palestinian Chronicle. And I wrote an article about it for a Muslim magazine called Nasib Vibes. They invited me to write an article, and I thought that this will be appropriate. The title of the article is My Postage Stamp. And the article in the Palestinian news read as follows. 54% of the Palestinians asked were supported a two-state solution, okay, without massive immigration of refugees to Israel, with various shades and lights. And I was thinking to myself that we came a very long way. And I was thinking to myself that we have here a phenomena that was unheard of. If this polls, of course, is reliable, and if there is a heart and minds behind the numbers, then we are facing a situation where 54% of the Palestinians become Zionists. And I made a pause on purpose, because I know that Zionism has been in the air here in Duke University, and I started the article by saying, do you know, if you were to read a piece of news saying that 54% of the Palestinian majority became Zionist overnight, you would probably rub your eyes with disbelief and ask, must be April Fool's Day. It isn't. Well, how does one put the two together? Despite what you heard about Zionism, the Zionism dream is nothing more than just a piece of land with undefined borders. I'll tell you what borders later, okay? Living in peace and friendship with its neighbors. And that has been the dream from day one, from Theodor Herzl, who met the first Basel conference, Zionist conference in Basel in 1896, okay? And through the Balfour Declaration and so on. And the trouble is, what I realize is that people really do not know what Zionism is all about. And here is a chance for me to explain it to thousands and thousands of Muslims that read this magazine. I think it's a great opportunity for me. So I named it the postage stamp. Why? Because in the 1937 year, the British appointed commission called the Peel Commission has came up with a plan, a partition plan, which gave about 25% of the current area of Israel to the Jews and the rest to the Arab. And the leadership of the Zionist movement debated fiercely for a week in the conference, in the Congress, and they accepted it. The Arab leadership rejected it with a nice slogan, not even the size of a postage stamp. Okay? And me, growing up in Tel Aviv, that metaphor of a postage stamp was a driving motivation, and many of my friends, all we want is one postage stamp. That idea was not recognized, is still unknown in the public in general. People think of Zionism to be a land-grabbing, Kabbalistic, secret society. Okay? It isn't. It's just a dream for the Jews to establish a homeland in some area of the land of the Bible, okay, and live in peace with their neighbors. Okay. How the distortion took place through the history, we can discuss it perhaps here, but somehow I believe that if that history of the idea becomes known to Palestinians, to Muslims, and to Jews, I bet many Jews do not know what Zionism is all about. Okay. That we are going to make a big step toward understanding and peace.
I agree here, Judea, the double narrative, as it were, the Israeli narrative and the Palestinian narrative, read together and read together by both people, would certainly allow both to understand not only the history of where they're coming from, but also, I think, the subsequent developments, the pain, the dislocations, the expectations. But Judea, you may want to enlighten, certainly me, on the nuances between anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, which seem to swirl around and are thrown around, sometimes interchangeably. How would you disentangle them, and how would you explain the differences?
Yes, my personal opinion is that anti-Zionism is the worst form of racism. And now let me explain to you why. First, it is racism. Let's agree on that first, and then I'll explain to you why it is the worst form. It is racism because it denies one collective the right that is given to others. Here I'm talking about the right for self-determination, repatriation. That if you give that right to collectives such as Palestinian, Basques, Irish, Danes, you ought to give it to another collective that call themselves Jews. Now the argument against it, for instance, the argument is Jews are religion. Religions do not have the right for self-determination, right? Where did you hear about the Catholic state except for the Vatican? Of course, the Muslims do have a religious state, but we do not want to appear like creating a religious state or a theocratic state. What happens is that due to our turbulent history, unique and turbulent history, Jewishness is more than religion. One cannot separate history, ethnicity, nationality, culture in the land, in the Jewish experience. Okay? These are all intertwined. Okay? And the Jews are as much a nationality as they are religion. As a matter of fact, there's more national cement among Jews than there is religious cement. I'll give you an example. Some of the readers from Nasib, the Muslims one, responded by saying, how come we Muslims always bicker with each other and we blame each other for not being a good Muslims? How come the Jews can act in unison? Okay?
So they assume that all Jews are united. They have the impression of the monolith.
Correct.
Monolithic
They have
Jewish,
the impression of the Jews to be a monolith, and the Muslims keep on fighting with each other on who is a good Muslim or who is a true Muslim. And the reason is that the religious cement among Muslims is stronger than the national cement. Most Jews are secular. It's a secret that I can only reveal to my good friends. Okay?
Don't repeat this.
The cohesiveness of Jews comes from history, comes from nationality, okay, and from tradition. Okay? That's what holds Jews together. And that is why Jews do not call each other, you're not a good Jew. Okay? Because even a sinner, a Jew who is even a sinner is still a Jew. Okay? So we have this family relationship despite our differences in religious nuances. Okay? So it brings it back now to the issue of Zionism. Okay? Therefore, I claim we are nationality, whether you want it or not. We see ourselves as nationality, and that is the definition of nationality. It's a collective of individuals who share history and share destiny and would like to become nationality. That is the definition of nationality. Okay. Therefore, we deserve a homeland. We deserve to be looked upon as nationality, and therefore, anti-Zionism claims you do not deserve that. Okay. Thou are destined for homelessness for the entire history. That's what anti-Zionism means, which means, first, it destroys, it abuses and attacks our identity. And second, it puts in jeopardy 5.5 million people who rely on that nationality and this existence of the State of Israel both for personal safety and for their dignity. Therefore, it's a racism. Now, why is it the worst form of racism? I know you will come to that.
I was wondering.
Because it targets the weakest portion of our nation, those that really need the State of Israel for physical survival and for dignity. We Jews are strong enough to handle attacks on our religion. We are seasoned. We are expert and seasoned in attacking anti-Semitic articles, like some of them were unfortunately published here in the Chronicle. That doesn't bother us too much. What bothers us is that our dignity has been trampled on through a strange and new strand of racism, disguising itself as political debate, which means, as a political debate, it is not subject to the etiquette that was developed in religious discourse. niceties and I would say even political correctness. That doesn't exist in political debates. And we have been exposed now to that abuse through the anti-Zionism strand of racism. That's what makes us feel under siege. And that's where we need help.
Now, Judea, you've expressed it very succinctly and passionately, and I'm grateful. I'd like you to comment on the dignity, security, and future of the Palestinians. How do you see that? Because we must see these narratives as both equally deserving of all our sympathy, all our need to make sure that both of them are able to live in harmony and security and safety, and with a great deal of mutual respect. This is the ideal that we would aim for.
Absolutely. And that is why the two-state solution is the aim, is my aim. And that is why a two-state solution is so appealing to most Israelis. Israelis have, it wasn't easy, but most Israelis came to the recognition that Palestinians deserve a state. But more than that Palestinians are a legitimate national movement. It took a long time for Israelis to realize that. If you remember, Golda Meir said, Palestinian, who are the Palestinians?
Yeah, you didn't recognize them. They existed.
They exist. And she had good reason to doubt it. Why? Because there were no national sentiments among Palestinians in the beginning of the century. That took place only after the Balfour Declaration, that the Palestinians recognized that they do have national cohesiveness, and they started asserting their nationality. So Golda Meir still lived in the pre-1917 era, and she said, who are the Palestinians? Now, if you look at the history, really, there were only 3 printing presses, in the beginning of the 20th century, in Arabic, in the whole Palestine. Okay? And I can quote more and more evidence, the fact that the Palestinians lived under conditions that did not allow national feeling to develop. Okay? So they had very good reason to doubt it. But as I tell you, the definition, Palestinians deserve national recognition and a state, not because of their history, not because they lived there for 2,000 years, but because they currently feel a national body. They currently have these feelings and this cohesiveness. Therefore, that's what makes them nationality, and that's why most Israelis recognize that they do deserve a state, not only a state, but a viable state, and they do deserve to live in peace and with dignity with their neighbors.
And I think every person of goodwill and good sense would want that. They would want 2 states living in harmony, 2 good neighbors. But the critical fact here would be, Judea, for people to change the way they look at each other, change their heart almost. And in this endeavor, I don't know what's being done. Are people on both sides reading Rumi, for instance? Because that certainly would help to go back to the roots of what is common, to what binds these peoples.
We have a lot of common with the Palestinians. We have language which is very similar. So many roots are in common. So many Israelis speak Arabic. And I agree with you that it requires an additional ingredient. It's not just the paper on which you sign the contracts. We ought to treat them as cousins. And by the way, it is a jargon in Hebrew to say our cousins. Sometimes people say it with the derogatory, look what our cousins do to us. Okay? But we keep on referring to them as cousins. Let me project to another story that...
And just to interject, what do they mean by cousins? Do they mean, in some sense, like Muslims would look at the Jews and say, these are people of the book, and therefore they are related to us? Would they mean that? Or?
No, more than that. They refer to Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael.
So it goes back there, same Abrahamic,
yes.
Yeah.
How widely is that known in Israel? How widely
I mean, how many, you know, not that you're a demographer, I realize, but when you say that people would refer to Palestinians as cousins, as people of shared Abrahamic faith, how widely is that sentiment felt?
Every Israeli learned the Bible by heart, which means they know the Genesis blank. Okay? The story of Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac is known to every Israeli. Okay? The fact that the Palestinians are considered descendants of Ishmael is also known. What is taken for granted. Okay? So this kind of relationship is known. Let me give you more than that. It's an article that not many people know about it. It was written in 1917 by David Ben-Gurion. 1917, okay, just before the Balfour Declaration. The Zionist movement was preparing itself now for building a national homeland in Palestine. And the realization that it is not empty hit the leaders even earlier, but they realized that they got to make some arrangement with the inhabitants of that land. Well, David Ben-Gurion wrote an article published in New York, okay? And it summarizes months of his research. He researched and came to a conclusion that the Palestinians living there in Israel are none others but the descendants of the Jews that were left in Israel after the Roman exile, after the exile by the Romans, were converted by force to Islam in the 634, I believe, was the conquest of Israel, and they remained there, but they are our cousins. Okay? So he tried to use a genetic connection to the Palestinian in order to smoothen the relation, in order to open the door for collaboration. And indeed, there was a period there where collaboration between the Zionist movement and the Palestinian leadership was about to develop. The idea was that these two national movements will fight together against the Ottoman Empire, okay? And then they receive their independence from the British. It didn't happen for various reasons, but I want to emphasize the fact that the Zionist leadership recognized the need to open, I would say, even religious avenues toward the Palestinians.
Although most of them were secular, they weren't very religious people.
That's why, but he understood that, that just secular reasons is not enough, that you need some mythological reinforcement. And indeed, genetic lineage is a kind of mythology that one can use.
Akbar, I don't know if Judea has sketched, I think, in a really interesting way, a sort of analysis of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and I wondered if you would want to talk a little bit about what I think you've called Islamophobia. As a
yes,
sort of,
Islamophobia simply means hatred of things Islamic or Muslim. And again, like the definition of Zionism, this word is a very interesting word. It's a new word. It's not a very pretty word. It's an ugly sounding word. And I'm partly responsible, and let me tell you the history of this word. There was a commission in England, the Runnymede Trust, and my very good friend, Rabbi Julia Neuberger, very prominent Jewish rabbi in England, she was on this commission with me, and we talked, and she said, I want to do something for the Muslim community. I'm going back 1991, 92. And we talked about this, and she said, I will propose a commission to examine hatred against Muslims. There was a commission to examine anti-Semitism, and I was the Muslim commissioner on that. And in fact, we came up with this word then, because there was no such word. Now, there is a growing Islamophobia, and that again feeds into the sense of Muslims feeling under siege, Muslims feeling angry, Muslims feeling being prompted and provoked into acts of violence. And it is happening all around us, whether we are conscious of it or not. We see in the media the Prophet of Islam being attacked. Now, Judea and I discuss this very often. Judea says many Israelis are secular, and we don't really bother if these biblical figures are attacked or not. But for Muslims, because in a cultural sense, they are still living in societies where respect for parents, for teachers, for great religious figures, that respect is still maintained. And people take an attack on the Prophet much more seriously than if someone said, let's attack your country. A lot of, I know Pakistanis would spend their time attacking Pakistan and the government and so on. But if it came to the Prophet, then unanimously, rich or poor or one sect or the other, they would feel offended, very offended. Now, it's happening so frequently here in the United States. And because the media here is seen in the Muslim world, and in the Muslim world, the religious leaders who see this and they pick it up, they're able to tell their followers that America is on a war path against Islam. And it becomes a huge problem for the administration. Because President Bush goes to the mosque, he's been 2 or 3 times, he invites Muslim leaders to the White House for dinner. I've been several times. He really is reaching out. But all that is cancelled in the Muslim world when you have these attacks in the media, because they're seen by millions of people. And that feeds into this irrational anger. And we see so much of this almost irrational acts of suicide, people blowing themselves up, people really spiting their face to and cutting their own nose. And that's exactly what's happening in many parts of the Muslim world. So we need to, if we're trying to get to the root of the problem, the roots of the problem, we need to discover what the problem is, and then we need to say, this is what should be done. Because if we do this, we will be able to relieve the pressure. We'll relieve the pressure in the Middle East, we'll relieve the pressure on the United States, and we will improve things in the Muslim world. So once again, the need to understand Islam, and the need to understand that there is a growing Islamophobia, and intolerance can be around a Muslim group. It can easily morph into anti-Semitism, a hatred of the other, simply because these people are slightly different, or they have a different faith or a different name. It can tilt into racism against people of a certain color. When you are going down the road of intolerance, it is a very slippery slope. And that is why any great society needs to be very careful about that particular road. And there is this growing Islamophobia that people are aware of.
Let me add to it that I just invented another word, xenophobia.
But Judea, we already got anti-Zionist. How many words do you want for one? I'm afraid no Nobel Prize for you for that, Judea.
The reason I invented this word, or this concoction of word, because I want to equate it on the same level as Islamophobia. Although one of them is considered to be a political
and one is a religious
and one is religion, I would like to equate the two, because our pain, I mean, I'm speaking here for Jewish students and for Jewish community, is equivalent.
So how would you then differentiate between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Because I would have equated anti-Semitism to Islamophobia.
Yes, on the basis of the definition.
So how would you differentiate between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
Anti-Semitism, uses the stereotype that Jews have a crooked nose, the Jews attempt to control the world, the Jews kill Christian babies for matzah, for Passover. We can handle it. That's not a problem. The thing we cannot handle yet, because it's so new and so vicious and so much in disguise. Okay? It hasn't developed antibodies yet. Okay? It's the anti-Zionism, which denies Israel the right to exist, denies the legitimacy of national aspirations for the Jewish.
But doesn't anti-Semitism do the same thing?
No, anti-Semitism It's a hatred of Jews for their religion, primarily for their religion.
So it's restricted to
Yeah,
religion.
anti-Semitism existed thousands of years before Zionism was invented.
So you're saying it's a particular denial of a set of political claims.
It's a denial of certain rights
Right.
for the Jewish collective.
Right. You know, we've seen in the last few months speaking of politics, some quite remarkable political events. We've had 3 elections, elections in the Palestinian Authority, elections in Afghanistan and Iraq. What do the two of you think about the prospects for lasting political change?
You are a politician, Akbar.
Politician? In my part of the world, that's an abuse. I've never been one, and I have no intention of ever being one.
I wouldn't tell you which part I come from.
But I see, Judea, the 3 elections among the Palestinians in Iraq and Afghanistan, conducted under very difficult circumstances, challenged by many people in that part of the world, but nonetheless turning points in their countries, because these are literally the first time democratic elections have been held. Now, to say a democratic election is not to say that you suddenly have a period of stability, a period of progress and so on, because that doesn't happen. That's not how things work. Life is never so neat and tidy. In Pakistan, 1970 elections were held. In 1971, the country broke up. It split into 2. So various forces are unleashed when you have elections in societies that are still tribal, sectarian. Ideologies are very different to westernized, industrialized societies. But the fact that they took place, I think, is hugely, hugely significant. And we have to continue encouraging that path. And we have to make the people feel that this is not simply a one-off, that we are committed, that we will stay the course, and we'll make sure that sooner or later, sooner rather than later, stability comes to that part of the world. Because above all, people, ordinary people in that part of the world really want to get on with their lives. They're absolutely fed up of being blown up by A, B or C or whatever ideological background people are blowing them up. And I want to, Judea just referred to that, and I think the members of the audience would appreciate this reference, the remarkable book authored by our remarkable friend Jonathan Sacks, who makes this point in a different way. Now, I don't know how many of you read Jonathan Sacks's book, The Dignity of Difference. But if you haven't, I would strongly urge you to get a copy of this book, The Dignity of Difference by Jonathan Sacks, the Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom. Now, his argument is, explaining the world, that it isn't a question of America versus the Muslim world or Israel versus the Palestinians. It is a world in which we are living, in which the polarization between the very rich and the vast poor is becoming so great that it's going to lead to an explosion. He gives this figure. 358 individuals own more financial assets than over half the world's population. Half the world's population earns less than $2 a day. 40 million people have HIV/AIDS. 3 million died of AIDS last year. Now these are figures, they cut right across Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Hindu lines. And Jonathan Sacks is arguing that it's a question of the Abrahamic faiths, and he's very clear on this, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, confronted by a world where you have this high consumerism, materialism, the violence around us in our societies, and he says that is the real clash taking place. And I really believe this because in my own book, Islam Under Siege, I'm arguing the same thing, that these various societies, whether they are the Israelis or the Muslims or the Americans, they all feel simultaneously under siege. And this feeling of being under siege then provokes you into acts which are really dishonorable acts of violence, killing women, children, and equating them somehow to honorable acts. And these are, I believe, very important lessons for us to be able to live in this 21st century.
Judea, would you like to respond to that? Because then I would
Yes.
like to move it to...
I would like to respond to to ask you a question about the election in Iraq. I read the Arab literature in the press quite frequently, and I didn't see there the kind of receptiveness or the kind of jubilee that you might expect from here as a role model, a first Arabic state going through election. What I noticed was a mixture of approval combined with suspicion. And the suspicion comes from the fact that the whole idea of democracy is an import from the West. If it is imported from the West, then it ought to be suspect. Right? There's some conspiracy theory behind it. Okay. Could you relate?
Yes, partly right, Judea. The response has been lukewarm for several reasons. One, what you've identified, but also remember the sectarian dynamics of the elections. In the Middle East, which is largely Sunni, you suddenly have the emergence of a Shia-dominated government running Iraq. Now, Iraq is an important Arab country, and that's going to change the dynamics. And your next problem will be when you have the Shia-run government of Iraq saying, we want to be chums with the axis of evil along our eastern border. So, it's going to complicate foreign policy very soon, because if things are going to unfold in that direction, we will have a problem very quickly. Secondly, Judea, and here partly you need to be involved in this, a lot of the Arabs feel that America supports the dictators in the Arab world for its own immediate benefit, for realpolitik. So in a sense, it is America saying one thing, that democracy is a wonderful thing, we promote democracy, what a great ideal it is, perhaps for America. But for the Arab world, they're quite happy to support the local dictator. He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. That is the philosophy. And they're not idiots in the bazaars in Cairo and Amman and so on. They understand this. And they would not be jubilant, because they will say, here the strings again. They would like to see, I firmly believe this, and there's no way out of it for the Muslim world. They must be put on the path of genuine democracy. If it fails once, let them do it again. Fails a second time, let them do it. Eventually they'll get it right. But there's no escape from this. And this is where America can help. It must not compromise on the ideal of democracy. And there is compromise, and that's why you see this muted response. You're right, people don't believe it. They say there's still some trick up their sleeve. These are people who are puppets. They're being appointed here so they can continue the policies from Washington and so on. There is the general cynicism in the bazaars.
I'd like to open it up now to the audience. We have a microphone here and one here. And perhaps if we could bring the lights up just a little bit. Oh, wonderful. That's great. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you both very much for your words of wisdom. My question is for Dr. Ahmed. I've been reading in the past few days about the recent suicide bombing in Tel Aviv. Responsibility was claimed by Islamic Jihad. And I'm struck in these news reports by the use of the word collaborator, which seems to be synonymous with betrayer. And I'd like to know, since peacemaking is a collaborative process between enemies, how the Quran treats collaboration between enemies.
First of all, the Quranic position should be very clear to everyone. And I'm grateful you raised this question about suicide. The Quranic position reflects almost exactly the Jewish position. I even have the verse from the Jewish text which echoes the Quranic verse, that the taking of a single life is like the taking of all of humanity, the lives of all of humanity. And the saving of a single life is like the saving of the lives of all of humanity. That is the position of the Quran. Now, in terms of people blowing themselves up in the Middle East, in Chechnya, even in Pakistan, this is a new phenomenon. It isn't a phenomenon associated with one particular religion. It happened with the Tamil tigers, you may remember, in Sri Lanka. It is happening in different parts of the world. And this is really reflecting what I have been talking about in terms of a society feeling under siege. These are people who are desperate. An act of suicide, when you kill yourself, it is the final straw. And for a Muslim, as for a Christian, as for a Jew, to kill yourself is really violating several moral injunctions. We believe, Muslims believe, that God gives life and only God can take life. I can't commit suicide. And then to go and commit suicide and kill innocent women and children, that is absolutely unacceptable. And yet this is happening. And some people are putting a religious spin on it. So you have all the facts in front of you, and you can only try to put the pieces together in the context of what is happening in the Middle East. And therefore I say, and this is why Judea and I talked about this, if we can pull back and introduce notions of some respect for each other, maybe even affection, maybe even love, what Rumi talks about, you'll see the end of suicide attacks on all sides. If you don't have that, you will continue this lunatic cycle of violence that you're seeing.
I just want to add a remark on that related to the two figures that you see here on the screen. One of them is my son Danny, and the other one is the cleric.
Danny's on the right.
On the left. And the other one is a cleric by the name of Yusuf Qaradawi. The reason I want to mention it in relation to the question about the suicide is that this picture was not displayed in Williamsburg. And the reason is that our moderator knew who Yusuf Qaradawi is. He is the one who invented the logic that suicide bombers against Israeli is permitted. Permitted because there are no civilians in Israel. They all serve in the army eventually in some form or another. Therefore, killing children or pregnant women is all permissible by the logic of Mr. Qaradawi. I mention it here because I don't want you to get the impression that I endorse that fellow. As a matter of fact, he became controversial last week. He was given a big red carpet by Mr. Livingstone, the mayor of London. And there was a big controversy. How can you welcome him to the town hall? The publication here and there. Anyhow, when Danny interviewed him, Danny was always accurate and faithful to and respectful to the material that he covered. And it is there. Part of his interview is this logic. And Danny, you see, knew his cousins in Israel. And he knew that if they go to the army, they shoot and they cry. It's not a matter of, And still, it's important to realize that clerics of that nature, distort Islam. And they sit in a position which is very influential. Qaradawi has a 2 hours host program on Al Jazeera. It's called Sharia Alive. And he gets phone calls from all over the Muslim world. He's considered to be an authority. What can you do, to minimize the influence of such logic?
Well, this is a very important point Judea has raised. I mentioned the media here. You have so many negative things being said about Islam which are seen in the Muslim world. We are at the same time aware that in the Muslim world you have so many negative things being said about America, about Israel, about the Jews. The fact that the protocols of the elders of Zion was made into a television documentary. It was assumed that it was a correct interpretation of history, whereas we all know that it was a concocted version by the Tsar's secret police at the end of the 19th century. And yet millions and millions of people will see that and say this is the truth. So it is as Judea said, what do we do about it? It is a debate, it is a battle of ideas, and we need to reach out. We need to reach out to people like this cleric. That is, in some ways, in some small ways, people like me, we are doing exactly that. When I write here in the United States, I'm simultaneously published in the Muslim world. I'm constantly in touch with the clerics, with the young Muslim groups, with the community leaders, and we need more of this. We need more of this kind of dialogue, and that's all we can do, because it is a race against time, that while we have a lot of positive developments, and I pointed some of them to you, we also have a lot of very negative developments. Every time you take one step forward, you have to take 2 steps back. So we need to constantly be aware of this.
Thank you. I'd like to hear some
And could the person asking the question introduce themselves so we have an idea? It'll be interesting too.
Sure, that'd be great. Tell us who you are.
I'm Barbara Chaikin, and this isn't my question, but I wanted to just follow up on what you said.
And Barbara, by you signed to both of us. Who did you mean?
Dr. Ahmed, to you. I just wanted to follow up on what you were just saying. It's not my question. I'm curious why, after September 11th and on till right now, there haven't been more Muslim voices like yours in the Arab world refuting the publications and the rhetoric that is so anti-Semitic.
Well, Barbara, a very good question. In fact, Judea was kind enough to mention this event at the National Cathedral last Sunday. And from the pulpit of the cathedral, I in fact made a call which was very rare, probably the first time it's ever been made, offering a kind of challenge to the clerics in the Muslim world to invite Jewish and Christian scholars to the mosque. We have been very much involved in this dialogue. There are not many, because many things are happening here, Baba. Number one, Muslims feel very marginalized in the United States today, which is a big tragedy. Muslims living in America are Americans. Their loyalties are here. And yet, over the last few years, they have been slowly marginalized. In some senses, they've been demonized. The media's got these programs like 24, I don't know whether you saw this Fox News TV program, every neighbor, every Muslim neighbor is a suspect. Now what that does to a potential population of great allies is to neutralize them. And it made no sense to me. Maybe you can explain it. Because if I was fighting a war against a certain group of people in a certain part of the world, which I did not know very well, I would try to cultivate people from that part of the world who are my allies. But what we saw was that not only have they been marginalized, but constantly you get this insult to their religion or the prophet or the whatever. So from marginalization, I'm even sensing an alienation. So it becomes very difficult in that environment to suddenly begin to talk about dialogue and bridge building. A lot of people would simply tell me, you're an Uncle Tom, you're just sold out, you're a Zionist agent. Because they don't want to hear this kind of thing. They'd be much more responsive if I talk like these people and say the Jews are enemies and so are enemies and they're out to get us and it's all a world conspiracy. That's why very often when I don't have to go out and do these things, I go and do them. Because I'm aware that at this moment in time, it's absolutely crucial, both for America and for the world of Islam.
And I'd like to encourage you to keep doing it more in the Arab world, where I think your voice is needed more.
No, it's the same.
But
you see, you're right. And again, remember, don't keep emphasizing the Arab world, because the Muslim world is an entity. It's very different, as I pointed out, and yet it is an entity. What happens in the Arab world has an impact on us in South Asia, in Afghanistan, and vice versa. You must remember that. And therefore, this kind of discussion, for instance, when Judea and I had our first talk in Pittsburgh, that was reported in the Arab world. It was picked up very widely. So all this does have an impact somewhere.
Okay.
And that's the hope.
Barbara, if you have a question, make it really short because there's a lot more people.
Okay, I first, before my question, I wanted Dr. Pearl to offer my heartfelt sympathy on the loss of Danny. I don't know of another murder that moved me personally more, and I feel so much for your loss, and I wanted to say that. I also wanted to say that I do not see any difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I think if you are anti-Zionist, you are anti-Semitic by definition, because you're denying Jews the right to exist and right to a homeland. My question, Dr. Ahmed, is in the Quran...
Now, Barbara, you've come back to me. I'm noticing that. We must have parity here.
Okay, but here's my question, and it is to you. I was just responding to your comment when I came up to the microphone. But my question is it true in the Quran that there, as a scholar of the Quran, I have read, I mean, since you're the scholar, I've read that there are anti-Semitic comments about Jews in the Quran. And if that is so, how can we ever get to a place where there is acceptance of Jews and of Israel?
Very good question, Barbara.
Could I just interrupt? What I'd like to do, if it's okay with the two of you, is maybe to cluster questions so that more people get a chance to ask questions.
Yes.
So,
I will answer your question, Barbara.
He will answer that question, Barbara. Thank you. But Mikey, if you could, I'd like to have 3 questioners ask their questions, and then we'll have some responses, and then hopefully we can get to a second group as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Mikey. I'm a sophomore at Duke. Actually, this is about Zionism, too. It's addressed to Dr. Pearl. I was really interested to hear the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and it seemed that anti-Zionism, as you stated it, or Zionism better yet, as you stated it, allowed or granted the rights in a two-state solution. It allowed Israel to exist and allowed all the Jews to have a sovereign nation. What are your comments on a one-state solution and whether or not those rights are still granted to Jews in a one-state solution, or whether they're disallowed? Thank you.
Thank you, and one more questioner. Thanks.
I'd like to thank you both for coming. My name is Nick Renner. I'm a sophomore here. Earlier tonight, I was fortunate enough to have dinner with both of you, and I want to pose this question to both of you. Dr. Ahmed, you asked me what I thought was the most important thing in creating dialogue on campus between Muslims and Jews, Arabs and Jews, whatnot. And I'd like to pose that question to both of you. How can we sort of better facilitate these sorts of things on our own campus? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to go first?
The question was what's my opinion about the one-state solution. Right? First, me personally, I believe it is just euphemism for liquidation of Israel. And it's not only me. The trouble is that this is the opinion of 95% of Israelis. And these 95% of Israelis are needed for any peace agreement, for any movement toward peace. So you cannot threaten 95% of the population with what they believe is liquidation, a threat of liquidation, and hope to get some progress along the peace process. The second question was about, let's leave it here.
Actually, why don't, because the two are sort of similar, and so Akbar, why don't you respond to the question about anti-Semitism and
Yes, Barbara asked a very important question because this comes up quite regularly. The Quran is like all holy texts, the Bible, the Torah, the Old Testament, the New Testament, reflecting a divine being or vision or will. There are certain things which are said, if taken out of context, are highly offensive to other people in that region. The Bible is full of references to smite and to smite forcefully and so on. We all know these references. Similarly, the Quran talks about standing up for truth and justice, even if the Jews or the Christians or the Muslims, and this is not known in this verse because the Muslims are also included, so that you are able to stand up for a principle And the principle is important. So if you consider that anti-Semitic, you can also consider that Islamophobic, because that is exactly how the Quran talks about these incidents. Secondly, the Quran is revealed in the context of its time. There are many incidents taking place. There's a particular war, for instance, taking place. The Prophet is involved in a certain war and he has a revelation about a certain specific event in time, which today to us makes no sense. And then there are general principles of conduct. And for me, as a scholar, it's much more important to extract the general principles of how are we able to understand each other as different human beings, different societies. That first verse says, so you fight the Jews, you fight the Christians, and you fight the Muslims who will not accept the truth and justice and so on that God wants on earth. But, and Barbara, this is the second line, but if they prefer peace, then make peace with them, because God prefers peace over war. Now that is the Quranic verse, and you can check that up for yourself. As far as Nick wanted the question about encouraging the process of dialogue on campus, I would simply say to do exactly what we did over dinner, Nick, to talk about where we are coming from, what the misunderstandings are, and there are sometimes genuine misunderstandings, sometimes we can't do very much about them, sometimes perhaps we can simply ease our misunderstanding of each other. But this process needs to start. Americans need to reach out to the Muslim community. The Muslims need to reach beyond their own community. They need to be talking in synagogues and in churches and reaching out, because they're Americans, they're living here in America. And America is a land that is multi-religious, multicultural, and has a tradition of respecting other religions. And Muslims must play a part in this. And I know they are playing a part. I know that many groups are very actively involved in this kind of Abrahamic dialogue. I know that here on campus, you have people like Imam Wahid very involved in this interfaith Abrahamic initiative.
Thank you. Let's have 3 more questions.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. My name is Vaibhav Upadhyay. I'm a sophomore at Duke. I was wondering if you felt that there was an inherent schism between the Jewish and Islamic traditions where there would not be able to be an understanding between the two, or if you felt that throughout history the various political institutions that either claim to be Islamic or Muslim or Jewish had fought to create a schism to unite their people, and if this fundamental difference or politically created difference had, had a final formation in the state of Israel.
Could you ask to repeat? I couldn't quite guess.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Briefly,
Could you just repeat the gist of your question?
I guess the gist of my question is...
It's the echo here.
Oh, should I just yell it to you?
Do you feel that there's a difference between the two faiths fundamentally, or the political institutions that champion those faiths cause the difference to form?
Could everybody hear that? Is there okay, everybody could hear that? I can't hear what people are responding, but no. Okay, is there a fundamental difference between the two faiths, Islam and Judaism, or have the political institutions associated with those religions caused differences to develop? Is that a fair summary? Yes, please, go ahead.
My name is Momin Achima. I'm a sophomore at Duke, and Professor Akbar, you probably know my mother. She has been Noawa Taibas Jima. And I guess I wanted, since you brought up the idea that there might be like an economic consumerist aspect to this conflict and like the anger and the hatred that exists in the contemporary conflict, I guess my question to you is, to what if this is like, I mean, the September 11th attacks did occur on the World Trade Organization, like an economic landmark, and I mean, even if you go to like the Masjid al-Haram in Makkah, you step outside and there's a KFC and like McDonald's. There's like globalization going on everywhere in the Muslim world, and they're not really, they can associate it with Americanism and like democracy, and there's all these like relations being made, and I'm wondering if there's an economic aspect to this problem, how would we focus on that? Because it seems more subversive than like just talking about faith.
Thank you. One more. We've got politics, we've got economics, so let's see what's number 3.
I hope you guys are enjoying our wonderful campus. I'm Saad Mir. I'm a student of Dr. Musa's class, and my question is more about my confusion over the concept of a Zionist state. You mentioned that Jews or Israelis, I forget which one, are they're secularist. So is the Zionist concept, is that based upon the fact that there's a Jewish influenced constitution or Judaic influenced constitution, or is it just an area of predominantly Jewish people? Because I know there have been some acts of pushing some Arabs out of Israel, or I'm not exactly sure, but so that's my question.
Well, the question about whether there's a fundamental problem between the Jewish and the Muslim faiths, and indeed the Christian, the answer is clearly no. And that is borne by history. For centuries, these faiths have lived together. There may have been wars between the Crusaders and the local people and between dynasties, but those are wars. They're imperial wars, they're wars of kingship, they're wars of states. They're not religious wars per se. Christian communities and Jewish communities have lived together, and very often there's a danger of idealizing this, because no community is perfect on earth. They always have all the frictions that all societies have, but they have had centuries where they've been able to not only live as good friends and neighbors, but produce literature, art, architecture. Take Muslim Spain as an example. One example only. I can give you more examples. Come to my part of the world in South Asia. The example I give is of Akbar, Akbar the great Mughal emperor. Akbar ruled what today would be Afghanistan, Pakistan, India and Bangladesh. That was his empire. And Akbar built a new city at Fatehpur Sikri outside Delhi. And at the entrance to this magnificent city, there's a grand entrance, a grand portal. And as you enter, inscribed on it are the words, "This world is a bridge, build not upon it, but pass lightly on it. Thus saith our Lord Jesus, peace be upon him." Think about this for a moment. A 16th century emperor, the most powerful emperor possibly on earth, is building a new grand capital. And who is he quoting? The Prophet of Islam? He quotes Jesus. You have a professor on campus. His name is Ibrahim Musa. Familiar names? Abraham, Moses. He's not Jewish, he's Muslim. So the notion of something structurally preventing very close relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, to me, doesn't make any sense. Yes, politics intervenes, disagreements intervene, misunderstandings, but so do they intervene within societies. Muslims have been fighting Muslims and Christians have been fighting Christians for centuries. But structurally, there is every possibility of good, harmonious relations. And they have lived together in harmony in history. And there's a great deal that Islam owes Judaism, particularly, and Christianity. Therefore, Islam very consciously looks upon the legacy of the Judeo-Christian tradition as its own inheritance. And it prides itself on those links with Judaism, on these great figures that we share, from Abraham down to Moses and all the other great figures that you are familiar with. Judea, there's one question on globalization that I'd just like to refer to. The question of globalization was raised, and I think I mentioned this when I talked about Jonathan Sacks and in my own book, Islam Under Siege, because we really are living in some senses as victims of this era in which we live, the era of globalization. So while globalization has many, many pluses, and there are incredible advances being made in communications and medicine and transport and so on, there are also major upheavals being caused by globalization. And that is creating a problem for many traditional societies. And that is one of the arguments that I sustain in my book, Islam Under Siege, where I point out that not only Muslim societies, traditional societies, whether they're Hindu, whether they're Buddhist, they are facing the consequences, the backlash of globalization.
I want to add to the question of the difference between the Muslim and Jewish tradition. Perhaps it's cultural, but I have noticed a difference. Perhaps it's a matter of approaching the religious scripture. I used to believe that there is a difference in the following sense, that we Jews take things lightly, and Muslims, on the other hand, take things seriously. As far as the stories of the scriptures, as far as the sanctity of the major figures, and so on. For instance, I will give you an example which I gave before. Remember, I said we Jews can say very humorously, Moses made a silly mistake. Okay? I'm not sure that you could find many Muslims who would say that about Muhammad. Another example I'll give you. I asked my rabbi, I'm not, but my rabbi, to explain to me how Prophet Samuel told King Saul to kill with cold blood the king of the Amalekites. You know, it was, I would say, atrocious things to do. You know, and he told me, Samuel got it wrong. And he had a dream, and he didn't interpret it correctly. Could you imagine that? We don't have saints. We have fallible prophets, okay, that are subject to mistakes. They dream things, and they turn out to be a wrong dream. So we question the authority of our saints, and we question the authority of our rabbis, and we question the authorities of everybody, including the American authorities. Okay? Namely, that is a trait that you can attribute, and my book, by the way, our book, I'm Jewish, shows it quite nicely, how we learn to question authority, to question dogma and conventional wisdom. And that is an interesting ingredient that one can characterize the Jewish scholarship with. And I wonder if you would say that this is a religious induced, because after all, Islam stands for submission, and Israel stands for struggling. Some people attribute that as deep as the original scripture. Do you believe that there is an effect of the original?
I would say, Judea, there's a cultural factor here, that the Jewish relationship or thinking of Moses, for instance, would have been very different a few centuries ago. As we discussed, that during the time of Maimonides, who looks on Moses as this great central figure, because he's really reflecting the Muslim respect for the Prophet of Islam, and therefore there's an equation in his mind, or in the times of Salahuddin, this is now 12th, 13th century, when they are looking for a similar figure within the Jewish community. You're, of course, very much reflecting the 20th century, the modernized European mind and its attitude to religion. So there's a healthy skepticism or even an irreverence. Now, that is not to say that there is no Muslim humor around religion. And this will surprise you, but for this last few centuries, there are jokes and there are irreverent remarks, particularly about the mullahs. There's an entire series of jokes around Mullah Nasruddin. He's a legendary character, and all his jokes are about mullahs and how hypocritical they are and how they say one thing and they mean another thing. So the notion of Islam as a monolith, rather humorless monolith, is simply not correct. If Muslims tend to be much more serious and much more believing or much more loyal to Moses, then Muslims would simply say, we are better Jews than you are.
That's beautifully put. Can I just...
this is my hope.
Our time is nearly at an end. What I'd like to propose, just because actually 4 people have been standing very patiently, if you can get your questions down to 1 sentence each. This is actually a great intellectual challenge. Can you do it in 1 sentence without taking a breath in the middle of the sentence? Then we could perhaps hear from those first 4 people who were so patient, and then just closing comments and anything that you'd like to do in response. Just pick one if that's okay, because our time is really short. And if you could please come up to the microphone so folks can all hear. Just pick one of your questions.
Okay, this is in regards to Dr. Pearl's comment regarding anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and another young lady's comment about how anti-Zionism is very much the equivalent of the racist sentiments of anti-Semitism, which is a very long history. And I'd just like to state that, from a personal perspective, I know several Jewish people from my childhood through nowadays who take offense to that, because given the long history of anti-Semitism and versus disagreement with the political ideology that you yourself have stated, sir, is secular ideology. And you stated that that being anti-Zionism denies a basic right for Jewish people to return to their homeland, which ironically is also based in a religious belief. So my question to you, sir, with all respect, is for those Palestinians who were displaced as a result of this right of return and who want their land back, what would you say to them if they have disagreements with Zionism?
I'll refer them to a Palestinian newspaper by the name of HaKarmel. It was published in 1936, in which the statement is, we all recognize that this country can absorb 5 more million people without a single Arab being displaced from his land. And still, we do not want you to build to have a postage stamp, okay? Which means it wasn't a matter of dispossession, and I do not know of any Palestinian that was dispossessed before 1948. Okay? The land was bought for hard cash. I still have the certificate that my grandfather bought when he got this sandy land 7.5 miles northeast of Jaffa. Today it's called Bnei Brak. It was bought with hard cash with inflated prices.
Just to clarify, you do acknowledge, though,
that
people were displaced.
I really am going to have to, I'm really sorry, but okay. I really am going to have to ask you to allow others to.
My question is similar but shorter. My name is Nathan Hodson. I'm a senior here. Dr. Pearl, my question is also for you, also slightly related to Zionism. I was hoping for a clarification. Is it your contention that it's racist to deny a state to a people who considers itself a nation with shared history, shared destiny, and a shared cohesion? Is it racist to deny a group like that a state?
Okay, thank you. And let's hear number 3 and number 4, and then we'll turn it over to
Thank you for coming. My name is Ibrahim Samara. And you guys both spoke earlier about this issue of misinterpretation on both the part of what is Zionism and who are the Palestinians. And I feel that if that is the major obstacle, this lack of understanding of who the other side is the case, I feel that it's being driven and reinforced by like a stranglehold of economics and politics. And is there any way, what is the best way to institutionalize bridging that? I mean, is there any way that we can seriously try to bridge that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ben. A lot of fuss is made in the media about America's credibility as a peacemaker in the Middle East, or the lack thereof, and America is a Christian nation. So I was wondering what you thought that American Christians can do, if anything, to foster peace between Jews and Muslims in the Middle East? Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask each of you then to respond to whatever you've moved to respond to, and then to also offer any closing reflections you have.
There's a quick question here that asked me whether I believe that denying a collective of individuals the right for a state is racism. I said, yes, if you grant these privileges to all other collectives of similar nature, of national character.
I would simply, do you have a question?
In line with other questions that have been asked, you talked about anger. Are you, either of you, implying that if Palestinians have a state, that the anger will be lessened and thus the violence will be lessened? Is that part of the solution to the problem?
Yes, that would be an important part, but not the entire solution. Because, and I keep pointing this out in my book, that you have major problems in the Muslim world. You have a gap between the rich and the poor. You have vast amounts of unemployed, illiterate youth. You have people interpreting Islam in a certain way. These are major problems and they won't go away. It will certainly help if you resolve this issue. That's a major issue. But remember, the Arab world is 18% of the Muslim world. And now the Muslim world is involved. And America, the question was raised about America. America is involved in the Muslim world in a really structural way as no other time in history. America is giving $4 billion in aid to Pakistan. Now my question is, the question was raised about what can Americans as good Christians do? Americans as good Christians can do a great deal. Emphasize education to start with. $4 billion aid going to Pakistan. Half of that is going straight for tanks and helicopters. Who do you kill with tanks and helicopters? The people of Pakistan. Are they going to be grateful to the Americans? They're not going to be very grateful. They're going to say, we are being killed, and we can read the label made in the United States of America. So we've got to be thinking in terms of long term. You want to change people in that part of the world? Give them good syllabi, give them good teachers training programs, teach them their own history and their own culture, teach them Islam, teach them the tolerant, compassionate Islam of Rumi. And automatically, like an oil tanker in an ocean, you will see an entire civilization shift. And if you don't, it's going to continue as it is, and I'm afraid in that sense, I'm not particularly optimistic in the direction it's taking.
To answer the question about whether the creation of Palestinian state will resolve the problem, will diminish the anger, I think the state in itself and the contract signed, the agreement signed is not sufficient. And we need mythological justification for the agreement. We need the Palestinian and the Israeli to believe that they ought to accommodate the other side and to have a more positive model of the other side, to stop dehumanizing each other. And that is a precondition, because otherwise another intifada will develop, I believe, in a few years.
And that is why the only answer, and this is my closing statement, 3 words: dialogue, dialogue, and dialogue.
Judea?
I can only count to 3.
Well, I just want to thank both of you so very much. I was struck the other day by the death of Peter Benenson, who's the founder of Amnesty International, who started something that seemed in some ways quite foolish and quite small, and yet it became a global human rights movement and has often been referred to as a conspiracy of hope. I think that what the 2 of you are doing is a conspiracy of hope, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, book signing, yeah, right.